Hello, and thank you for joining me again today on the Finding Hope After Loss podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like the show, please leave a review or rating on Apple or Spotify. It only takes a moment and really helps the show reach more loss and infertility families. Today, I am talking with Kelly Durbin. She is an international board certified lactation consultant, childbirth educator, author, and volunteer breastfeeding counselor. In this episode, she discusses the various ways you can deal with your breast milk coming in after a pregnancy loss. She also talks about the grief you can feel from not being able to breastfeed your baby. Hello, everyone. Today I am here with Kelly Durbin. Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, primarily I'm a lactation consultant. I have been many things, though. I'm also a childbirth educator, a lactation educator. I did a whole bunch of doula training years ago, but after my kids were born, I just felt like it was too unpredictable. I couldn't leave my house in the middle of the night. So even though I am very much a fan of birth work in that regard, I haven't been acting as a doula in several years, but I am still involved in lactation support very heavily. And I live in Phoenix, Arizona with my two kids, my husband, and my dog.
Sounds like you are pretty busy.
Yeah.
So, what is it that got you into that line of work?
Well, that's an interesting question. And of course, like most people or many people in the birth and breastfeeding world, I came to this work after having been through birth and breastfeeding myself. I think very few people wake up in their 20s, early 20s prior to having anything to do with birth, pregnancy, or breastfeeding and say to themselves, I'm going to become a lactation consultant. I think there are some people that really do this. Maybe their aunt was a lactation consultant and it was fascinating for them or some other way. But most people that I've ever met have come to this work just the way that I did. I ended up having a baby or two. I learned all I could about breastfeeding, and it is fascinating. If you have any interest in lactation, the more you read, the more you find that there's so many angles to this. And it's not really just about milk production. There's a whole social angle to it. There's the whole history of learning about the invention of formula and all the ins and outs and the ways in which that happened. Just all sorts of fascinating things that I really could not get enough of. So after my first daughter was born, I became involved with volunteer breastfeeding support, peer-to-peer breastfeeding support. And this is something that really is available all over the US, and it helps tons and tons of people who aren't plugged into professional support. So they go to these groups that are run by volunteers who are certified. And I've been doing that for 15 or 16 years. And after many years of providing volunteer support, I've thought to myself, well, maybe it's time to become a professional. And so I did. So that's how I became a lactation consultant.
Wow, and I never really thought of it in terms of what you were saying, like the history of it and the invention of, I mean, like I feel like you could just learn so much about it. You just think of it in terms of how it affects like you personally, like do I breastfeed my baby or not? But you don't
Right.
think about all the backstory, so to speak.
Yep. And there is a big backstory on that one.
I'm sure there is. And you're right too, that it has such a social meaning to it as well. The periods of time where, oh, you aren't supposed to breastfeed, you have to use formula, or the periods where, no, you can only breastfeed, you can't use formula. It's like
Hmm.
very interesting. I would get lost in that.
Yeah, it takes years to wade through all this information. It's a rabbit hole.
So I know one thing is that I was diagnosed with PCOS, and I know that I was told that breastfeeding could be hard or impossible for me. So do you know why that is, or why it might be harder for some people with conditions like PCOS?
So a lot of conditions can interfere with breastfeeding. And what's interesting about PCOS really is a metabolic in the underlying mechanism inside the body. It's a metabolic condition that deals with insulin. And not only that, but PCOS is a syndrome. So anything that ends with the term syndrome is a collection of symptoms, and not everybody who has that condition will manifest it in the same way. So PCOS, which is polycystic ovary syndrome, is, for some people, it can be very mild. You might only show up with a diagnosis of PCOS if you've had an ultrasound of the ovary that showed that you have these cystic ovaries, and you may not have any outward symptoms. For other people, there can be all manner of symptoms. This condition often involves weight gain, facial hair for women in places where we would rather not have facial hair, and metabolic disturbance. And at the base of it, it's insulin. It's an insulin related condition. And because of that, insulin can affect other hormones. So for some folks who have it in a more severe way, it can impact other hormones that do prevent them from being really successful with breastfeeding. Now, you mentioned that you were diagnosed, but you also said that you did not have a whole lot of lactation problems. And that may be due to the severity of the condition. For you, maybe it's not impacting your metabolic processes so much that it spills over into the hormones of lactation. So that may be why, because for each person who has PCOS, it's a different condition because we all manifest it in different ways. And like you, I was told years after my breastfeeding experience that I also have PCOS. I did have some of the collection of the classic symptoms, but I didn't have some other ones. So I often wondered, was it really severe for me? And to be honest, I never got to the bottom of it. So I don't know. But for many people, it can be a problem. For others, they just sail through lactation, not even realizing that it could affect them because it didn't.
Are there things that you can do to help that if you are struggling with like the breastfeeding?
Yes. So I would suggest for anybody who is struggling or has already been diagnosed with PCOS and you are thinking in the future, if you want to become pregnant or have a successful go at breastfeeding, PCOS can interfere with fertility as well. So just getting over the hump of becoming pregnant can be problematic for people with PCOS. So my recommendation would be, if you're already pregnant and you know you want to try breastfeeding, I would suggest working with a lactation consultant or a lactation counselor before your baby comes. You may also want to work with a doctor or a healthcare professional who is able to treat PCOS and the underlying metabolic conditions. So we don't just want to go at this from a symptoms standpoint, but we want to make sure that you're normalizing hormones, that you're working with somebody who's helping you move through metabolic disturbance so that you can regulate all the things that go into metabolism, because those things do spill over into our ability or the relative ability to become pregnant. So it can really dramatically affect your fertility and breastfeeding. So my biggest suggestion is get with somebody who is a known healthcare professional who works with PCOS. There's a lot of great information online, but people who have PCOS are not doomed to low milk supply. You can work with somebody who's a professional who can help you optimize your metabolism so that you can optimize your milk supply.
And that's something I would have never thought of, is to, meet with somebody beforehand. Because you always
Yes.
think of them as just, okay, I'm having a problem now while I'm trying to breastfeed, so now I go see one. But I think being proactive is a really smart thing.
Especially if you know that this was a condition that you've already been diagnosed with. Some people might not find out until they have trouble conceiving, and then they may become aware that they have PCOS or some symptoms that are consistent with PCOS. Sometimes, and I may have struggled with this for a little while, doctors may not be able to put their finger on the fact that the conditions that a person is exhibiting is in fact PCOS, because it's a collection of symptoms and there isn't one simple test to find out whether you are positive or not for PCOS. So if you suspect that you have it, I would say meet with a lactation counselor or a lactation consultant and get some idea ahead of time, while you're either trying to conceive or while you're pregnant, on what can you do to optimize your metabolism and therefore optimize your chances of successful lactation.
So, for people who maybe aren't familiar with lactation consultants, what are the benefits of having one or speaking with one, either before or after your baby's here?
This is a brilliant question. So, if you are inclined to breastfeed, and even if you're not, I would suggest one of the great benefits of meeting with somebody in advance is to take a breastfeeding class, prenatal breastfeeding class, because in that way, you're setting yourself up for making an informed decision about infant feeding. You may have all kinds of questions, but you won't necessarily be able to make the decisions on the fly right when the baby's born, because right then is not the moment for gathering information and for making informed decisions. Because if you didn't take any sort of breastfeeding class, and quite frankly, today we're super lucky that we have online, we've got Zoom, we have webinars. I know that WIC, the Women, Infant, and Children program run by the government, they offer breastfeeding classes free of charge to anyone all the time. You can always sign up for a WIC class, even if you know that you're not going to qualify for WIC benefits after your baby's born. So the education piece is open to everyone. So there's free information out there. And one of the major benefits of meeting with a lactation consultant before your baby comes is to get information, the information that you need to make good decisions and good choices for yourself during birth, because some of the things that we encounter during birth can interfere with lactation, birth interventions, the mode of birth, which basically just means how your baby is born. These kinds of things can impact milk supply. It can impact the timing of your milk coming in. And those are the kind of things that you might find out if you meet with a lactation consultant in advance.
Yeah, definitely right after birth was not the best time to be trying to make those kind of decisions on what you
Yeah, you want to have
needed.
some information under your belt so that you know what you're going to choose in terms of feeding and how you want to start feeding, because this may not be, it's obvious, but people don't think about it. You have to start feeding your baby right after the baby is born. There aren't any, like, there is no downtime. You don't get to cross the finish line and take a rest. You actually have to start right away.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't understand that breastfeeding can be hard. Like it's not just something that always comes naturally or something that is always easy right away. But I think with time and like you said, the education and knowing the different things you can try, I think that that's really important.
You make a really good point. And this is interesting because from the infant's standpoint, they're driven by instinct at the moment of birth, and they have instincts that will optimize feeding for them. For the parent, on the other hand, it is a learned skill. We are meant to be learning how to do this by community. So, if you think about this, like in the days before hospital care and, 500 years ago or whatever, people learned about lactation by family members. They would learn it from their aunts, their friends, their people in the community, the wise woman of the village. This is how we would learn about breastfeeding. But today, we're kind of unplugged from that type of living. And a lot of times it means that we don't encounter the information that we need before the birth happens. So yeah, it can be really important to get that information and get plugged in beforehand.
And especially when, so many of us have to go back to work so quickly, and then you have to add the pumping on top of that if you're going to keep that up. And
Yep, and that's a whole nother learning curve, isn't it?
definitely is. I did do the pumping for my first son because I had to go back to work at 7 weeks with him. But with
Hmm.
the other two, I was fortunate that they were able to stay home with me longer. But I did it because I loved him, but I did not like pumping.
Yeah, it is a whole different skill from breastfeeding directly at the breast. So yes, again, something else that we have to learn and prepare for.
So, is there a certain point during pregnancy that the milk starts to develop, or like a certain week that if you were to give birth at this week, like your milk would come in?
So people generally say it's about midway through pregnancy. I have read different things. What I most often see is around 26 weeks. So we all know that when infants are born premature, the milk is still ready. So by the time you're halfway through the pregnancy, your body has prepared for the process of breastfeeding to turn on. Lactation can turn on. And the thing that turns breastfeeding on is not necessarily the infant being born, it's the placenta being born. So after the baby is born and the placenta is out, the process of lactation has been turned on. And at the very beginning, that is hormonal. So once the baby is born, and your podcast today is a show about pregnancy loss. So we know that even if the baby doesn't survive, the mother's milk supply will still turn on once that placenta is out. And it can be distressing for so many people who go home without their infant. And maybe they were planning on nursing. They have this milk supply turned on, and now what?
That's exactly what happened with me. I delivered my daughter. She was stillborn at 32 weeks, and my milk did come in. And I don't know why I did not expect that. It's one of those things that you don't think about until you're like, oh my gosh, like it's still coming in.
Right. Yep. Because the body is absolutely prepared to nurture the baby. And there must not be, aside from the lack of input at the breast, there must not be another way that the parental body, the maternal body, interior, if the physiology can understand that this baby didn't survive and that we don't need this milk supply. It's actually coming in whether we need it or not after the placenta is born.
Are there certain things that you can do if you decide to dry it up, that you don't want to pump or do anything like that? Are there certain things you can do to help it dry up quicker?
So in the very first hours after birth, breastfeeding and the milk production is driven by hormones. And like I said, after the placenta is born, there's a massive shift in hormonal cascade from the profile of pregnancy hormones. The placenta comes out, assuming it's completely intact and no fragments remain in the uterus. Then there's a massive shift towards the hormones of lactation. And in the first hours and days after birth, that is a hormonal process. But after a few days, it starts to be driven by the fact that in order to nurse an infant, the baby must remove milk at the breast. When the baby is not removing milk, and in this case, because a baby didn't survive, or for instance, for a person who is a surrogate and is not going to provide milk for that baby, and the baby goes to the parents who are adopting it or who are actually the parents of the baby in the case of surrogacy, the person may want to dry up milk supply. And in the first few days, it's really not something that you can do immediately. It is kind of a gradual process. So there are certain methods that you can do, herbs you can take that will help speed up the process. The number one thing is to not remove milk from the breast. However, that can also be problematic because by removing milk from the breast, we're telling the breast, we're going to take away some milk so you can make more, right? In this case, our goal is to shut off the process of lactation. But in doing that, let's say cold turkey, where you think, okay, I'm not gonna remove any milk, the breast can become extraordinarily swollen. You can get edema, engorgement, and this can be really painful, and it can lead to a condition called mastitis, which could become problematic because it's a breast infection, and that can turn into an illness. So shutting down milk supply is kind of like an intricate dance between not removing so much milk that you signal the body to make more, but maybe removing a little bit of milk so that you're not so uncomfortable that you feel like, oh my gosh, this is unbearable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's kind of a fine balance of you have to
Exactly.
do just enough for relief, but not so much that you're signaling more production.
Right. And
What?
that's something that like we can't say, oh, you can only remove this many ounces. You just have to use your intuition and your best guide. Just remove enough milk so that you don't feel so overwhelmed. And frankly, this could be like take a warm shower, maybe the milk is already leaking. Just release enough and then, put on a nice supportive bra so that you don't feel like you're overwhelmed with the engorgement and swelling. And there are other things you can do. Cool compresses, gently using ice packs, maybe 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off for a while. This sounds like an old wives' tale, but it's actually real. You can use cabbage leaves tucked inside the bra. Have you heard about this one?
Yeah, I think I actually did try it at one point.
Okay. So cabbage can be really anti-inflammatory and it can help tissues of the body to stop swelling and bruising. Like, for instance, if someone sprains an ankle, you can take a cabbage leaf out of the refrigerator, roll it with a rolling pin so that some of those, like those little spiny, the hard pieces of the cabbage, they get broken down a little bit and they weep a little bit of the juice from inside the cabbage leaf, wrap it around the ankle, and let it sit for all day, and the swelling will go down. The same principle works for swollen breasts and gorge breasts and milk production. And it can actually help you to slow down milk production. I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism is there, but I know that many people have had success. It kind of sounds like something out of the dark ages, but it's real. So if you're struggling with wanting to stop milk production and it's getting to be a point where you feel it's painful, put some cabbage leaves in the refrigerator, take out the cool leaves, roll it with a rolling pin, and then tuck them in your bra.
See, I didn't know the part about the rolling pin though, so I probably wasn't even doing it right.
Well, and I'm guessing that even if you don't roll them, they still help. And of course, anything cool that you can place in the bra, and certainly cabbage leaves won't be cool forever since your body will in fact warm them up. But it definitely helps if some of the juice from the cabbage leaf has been expressed just a little bit, it becomes more potent on the skin.
And I'm sure you smell really great, right?
I
You
know,
smell
isn't
like
it?
cabbage.
It's a funny thing, right? Because it is a little odd, especially after like I did wrap my daughter's ankle once when she sprained her ankle. And after we took the wrap off, a couple hours later, we were both like, okay, this doesn't smell great, but it is very effective. So don't be put off by the fact that you might smell a little bit like cabbage.
Yeah, that's just temporary, right?
It
Just
is.
temporary to get the relief you need.
Exactly.
So I don't know if this is something that's different for everyone or if there's like a general time frame of how long it takes to dry up. Is there like a
That is
certain?
probably, yeah, it can be different for everybody because some people are really aggressive producers of milk. And this, it can be in if you think about evolution, like that's a great thing to have, except that when it's really overdone, it can, even when you're nursing a baby and you have like the milk supply for two, it can be overwhelming and that can cause problems too. So some people actually want to tamp down their milk supply even when they need it at the time that they're really nursing. So the time frame I would guess is, I think it probably takes at least 2 weeks. For some folks it could be longer, but remember that this is a gradual process when it's done optimally, because like I said a minute ago, if you want to go cold turkey and just simply not express any milk at all, you could run the risk of mastitis. So going with the idea of taking it down gradually, gradually, gradually. And some people actually pump milk with the idea of donating it. And in that way, also coming at this from a gradual perspective, but not necessarily like, okay, I want to stop milk production in the first month. Maybe they want to take a few weeks or a few months to donate milk to a milk bank or to another person, someone that they know who is needs milk at that moment.
So if you do decide to pump and donate, do you just start pumping right away, or like do you have to pump every 3 hours, like if you were nursing, or is it just dependent upon how much you're wanting to donate? Like,
Okay, this is a great question. I also think that part of that is accurate. You may not want to bring in a full milk supply if you're going to donate. Maybe you just want to donate for a few weeks. However, I will tell you this, most milk banks, when somebody signs up to become a donor to a human milk bank, most of them want a certain number of ounces from each person who is donating. So this could be different. Let's say that a person loses a baby, but her sister or her best friend has a newborn that is sick and they need donor milk. And they're not going through a milk bank, it's going to be informal donation. In that way, you could just pump and donate what you need because there isn't a minimum amount of ounces, right? But if you're working with a human milk bank, they will give you the guidelines and they may say, okay, we need each person who donates to commit to a certain number of ounces. And some people, even after pregnancy loss, are very motivated to do that, to meet that minimum, because it can be very, very cathartic for some people knowing that they are providing some life-saving milk to infants who are immunocompromised, infants who are preterm, babies who are born with very low birth weight or who have been sick or born to mothers who were sick. So it truly is an act of life-saving compassion in a lot of ways.
so I know that breast milk is made like when you're nursing your baby, that, it's made specifically for your baby. Is so I guess what I'm asking is, are there still benefits of using somebody else's breast milk? Like, do you still get the same benefits since it's not made like directly for them, if that makes sense?
So yes, absolutely. Because even though our milk can be tailor-made for our own infant, and the mechanism is that you and your baby share the same environment. So if you're at an airport and somebody sits next to you and they have a cold, you and your baby are both going to be exposed to this. The maternal milk supply will make antibodies for that specific germ or bacteria or whatever that you're encountering in your environments. And this works even if like an infant goes to daycare and the mother has never been exposed. Let's say the baby gets exposed at an environment where the parent is not frequenting, like a daycare situation. The baby, if they manifest this cold or some other illness, can, because mothers and babies are so closely sharing their environment at the time of day when they are together, the infant shares that bacteria, the cold, the germ, the virus with their parent, and then the maternal milk supply responds very quickly with milk that contains antibodies to that exact virus, that bacteria, or whatever it is that they've encountered. So you're asking, does this kind of thing work when we're donating milk? Or are there still benefits? So absolutely, there are benefits, but the donor milk, and this is really fascinating, a lot of people don't realize this. When a person sends milk to a milk donation facility, the milk that, let's say someone comes to pick up, is not milk from a single mother. So what the milk bank does is they pool milk from multiple people, they homogenize it, it's treated so that the profile of fats, carbs, and water, everything that goes into making up the milk, is actually pooled from a group of people who've donated milk. It's not milk from a single donor. So in that way, infants who receive donor milk are actually getting antibodies from multiple people, which is fascinating, right?
I had no idea.
Yes, I know. It's really a neat fact. So if you're doing donor milk for whatever reason, you're maybe even optimized in a way that you've got antibodies and input from multiple sources. So I find that to be really fascinating.
It is so interesting. Yeah, I definitely did not know that, but that's a
And
cool fact to learn.
all of human milk, no matter if it contains specific antibodies to any kind of germ or bacteria, all of milk that we make is beneficial because all of it is protective for the infant gut. And it contains anybody's human milk will contain all sorts of immune factors at high levels for people who have newborns, especially for protection of the infant, because in human biology, milk is designed that way. So it's one of its number one goals is actually protection of the infant and to boost immunity because babies aren't born with an active or full immune system. So the milk acts as a bridge to inform the infant gut how to build its immune system. So in that way, milk's one main design is to protect the baby. The secondary design is infant food, especially in the first couple of days. And I find that to be really interesting too.
I can definitely see why you went into this. Like I love learning all of this. It's just so cool, you know?
It is fascinating.
And it's just those things that we don't think about, on a normal daily basis. We just
Right.
think, okay, like my choice is breast milk or formula. That's as far as we go, you know? So are there any other options for people who have lost a baby, or is it just dry up or donate basically?
Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that. There are other things that you can do. So, first of all, and I'm sure you talk about this all the time on this podcast, it's important for people, no matter if they choose to donate milk or immediately stop their milk supply, to acknowledge the grief and sometimes even the grief over not people may obviously grieve the pregnancy loss, but some folks, especially people who've already had a baby and nursed a baby, they may end up grieving the lack of nursing, the fact that they were planning on nursing this baby and that isn't going to happen with this child, right? So that you may find that even unexpectedly that you feel feelings of grief about the lack of breastfeeding because for many people, especially those who've already breastfed a baby, it can be, it's an experience of a lifetime. It's something that you can't explain to someone who hasn't done it. It's almost like, in a way, it's like giving birth. It's really difficult to understand it before you do it, right? And you don't know. You might think to yourself, well, this is just infant food. It can't be that much of an emotional experience. But frankly, it's a human connection that we don't consider as a relationship until we've already gone through it, you know? So what I'm saying is it's important to acknowledge that women and parents, we really do need to acknowledge that people experience grief over the lack or the loss of breastfeeding. And that can be really, really painful for some people. So I want to extend this out there to folks that, it's okay to also need to have emotional support for grief when you're feeling feelings of loss when you can't breastfeed. And that goes frankly for anybody who finds that they can't nurse. So first of all, that's my first thing I wanted to mention. It's important to seek that care that you need for dealing with the grief. Second, you asked if there's any other thing that you can do. Is it just I'm donating milk or I'm just going to dry up this milk supply? So in the past couple of years, it's become a thing, I guess, what you call, to make milk into a keepsake, something that you might keep around after your milk supply is over. So you can actually make little pieces of jewelry out of milk. Now, I don't know anything about how this is done. I don't know anybody who does it, but I know if you go online, you can find all kinds of folks who are creators who have Etsy shops, who have, websites dedicated to milk keepsakes. So while you're expressing milk, you may need to collect a little bit of it. You get it to the person who is making jewelry. You can design a necklace or earrings or a little gem made out of milk that goes into a ring or a bracelet. And this can be a way for you to, or for anybody, to memorialize the baby and the milk supply that came along with that baby, even though it didn't work out as you had planned. So this memorializing through jewelry is something that's kind of new on the scene in terms of what we can do after lactation loss or, I mean, pregnancy loss where you are trying to slow down your milk production. So that's another thing that is something that people do, and in some ways it can help. It's beyond the little memory box that you might make for this infant, you know.
It's definitely something I wish I had known at the time, because
Me
I
too.
definitely would have pumped enough to make something, or but now I can't go back and do it. I was just like,
Right.
let's just make it dry up because I don't want to deal with it anymore. But
Exactly.
um,
And many people get to that point where they're just like, okay, I've done what I can either to donate or to gradually bring down this milk supply, and let's just end this. Because I know for some people it can be a reminder of the infant, of their baby that, didn't make it. So that can be really hard for a lot of people, which is why I'm suggesting to folks seek counseling, especially if the lactation is kind of a trigger for the feelings of loss.
I definitely had those feelings since I had a living son before she was born, and I breastfed him for a year. And so, yeah, I definitely, like, I was really sad when the milk came in. I'm like, this was supposed to be her milk, now it's just
Yes.
wasted. And, it was just, yeah. So I definitely agree that seeking help to talk about the loss of the breastfeeding experience too is important. And it's not something that you should feel bad about.
No, and frankly, I think a lot of people don't necessarily ever plan to, or even understand that like this might be a feeling that I feel. It could come on as a complete surprise. So especially like in your case, you have already nursed a baby for a year. You knew what that was about. And then grieving the loss of that is even more challenging because then it's two losses, the relationship of that baby and the nursing relationship.
Yeah, so now I'm glad that you brought that up, because I hope that it'll help some people know that, well, first of all, that it's okay to be sad about that and to talk about it. And then also to know that making the jewelry is an option. So you might want to save some of that milk if, if you are leaning towards that at all. So are there any other things, or is that?
I'm guessing there are things out there that people do that I'm not aware of, but generally, yes, it's either you decide that you're going to donate, and I have met folks who have donated milk, not just for months, but like for, a long term to their local milk bank. Now, I will tell you this, not every state has a milk bank in the US, and in Canada, there's only 3 provinces that have milk banks, but it's fairly widely distributed across the country. And some states that do not have milk banks will collect milk through a certain hospital or a location, and they will deliver milk to a milk bank in another state. So even if your state doesn't have one, if your state has a collection depot, you can still donate.
Are those usually like statewide things, or is it like by city, or does it just depend on where you are?
So interestingly enough, I was just looking at the states that have milk banks. There are only a few states that have more than one. So, for instance, I think Texas may have 2 milk banks. It's possible that California might have 2, but most of the states, and there are only 25 states with milk banks, and there are 28 milk banks. So there's only 3 states that have a duplicate. So you may be living somewhere. I remember I recently lived in Austin, Texas. There is a milk bank there, but you may live in Dallas, and that maybe there isn't a milk bank there. However, there may be a collection depot in that city where you are that will allow for milk drop off, and they will transport milk to the city with the milk bank. This is something obviously that people need to do a little bit of research on and kind of look around and find out, do I have a local milk bank? If not, is there a collection for milk in this city? So I live in Arizona. There is no milk bank here in Arizona, and someone told me recently that there is a collection depot. I think it's run by one of the big hospitals, and all the milk collected in Arizona goes to a milk bank in Colorado. So it is feasible. It just takes a little bit of research and a little bit of legwork to find out how to do it or where to drop off milk and the procedures that you need to follow in order to collect milk.
That's another thing I didn't know. I just thought that every state would have multiple ones, and
Yeah,
to know that some don't even have one is kind of crazy.
it is. Yeah, it really is. So there are new milk banks in the works. So the fact that today there's only 28 in the US, soon there may be others. And frankly, this is mind-boggling, but some countries have hundreds of milk banks. And the fact that the US only has 28 is really telling. Like we need to step up the game with donor milk because I'm sure that you're aware, and many of your listeners are aware, that in conjunction with the pandemic, we had a infant formula shortage. And this is yet another reason why milk donation is so critical. It's imperative. And if someone comes to milk donation through pregnancy loss, I know that is extraordinarily tragic, but the action that they can take by donating milk in this way is incredibly life-saving. And the fact that, like, in Brazil, they have over 300 milk banks. We have 28. So accessing milk for the infants who are preterm or they're ill or low birth weight, it can be really difficult, especially for babies who are not born in a state with a local milk bank or they don't have good access to something in a neighboring state. It can be really difficult for infants in those situations.
So there are certain infants, like you said, that would benefit more from having donor milk.
Yes. So anybody who is born preterm could, it's not that all babies need it, because as we talked about earlier, when preterm birth happens, the maternal milk supply is always ready. Some folks find it hard preterm to bring in a full milk supply. And in that regard, it might be that they are supplementing with donor milk. So the baby is only getting donor milk. And the reason for preemies to get donor milk, if we would prioritize that, and maybe this does happen. I don't work in that side of lactation, but it's really important because preterm babies have far more risk for problems to go wrong in terms of gastrointestinal health. So they are more susceptible or prone to illnesses of the gastric system, diarrhea, something called necrotizing enterocolitis, which is a disease, or I believe it's a bacteria that can attack the intestines and actually cause cellular death within the intestine. And one main risk is formula feeding. So for infants who are preterm, it really pays off for them to get a full diet of human milk. And they're very sensitive. So I believe in that way. It's also good for babies who are born with low birth weight, who may need to have a diet that's fortified. And in some ways, it's just better for them to have all human milk and sometimes fortified human milk. And that means that they're adding certain things to the milk. And it could be, sometimes it is fortified by adding elements of formula. It is not necessarily just mixing formula and breast milk, because that is definitely not how it works. But there are lots of methods for adding things to human milk for preemies who are very sick or ill that need fortified human milk.
See, these are all the things that I wish I had known and thought about beforehand because I mean, I don't regret my choice, but I just wish I had been more informed over what my options were.
Yes.
Because then maybe I could have helped another baby or, done something. But it's just, I think, important, like you said, to just educate people on what the options are before they get to that point of needing to make a decision.
Right. And sometimes when we're in a period of grief or stress, it can be really difficult to weigh the options and to think, well, do I really want to put this additional stress on myself right now? But for people who, especially somebody who has already nursed a baby, they may realize, like, okay, I don't have to turn off this milk supply immediately. I could spend some time here donating. It's definitely an option. But you're right. It does pay off to learn a little bit about it in advance. But we never ever think to ourselves, I'm going to find myself in this situation. So that's, it's really difficult. to imagine that, especially when you're in a position where, you're expecting a newborn.
That's true. And then when you find out that you've lost your baby and have to give birth, you're probably not thinking, you're thinking, I have to get through the birth. You're not thinking like, oh, my milk's going to come in. What do I do with it?
Right, exactly.
So is there anything else that you'd like to share or add?
Well, I do want to say that a lot of pregnancy loss happens before mid-pregnancy. And for many of people in that situation, they may not ever really see the shift in hormones to lactation because, as I said earlier, colostrum and lactation are really set up to turn on in mid-pregnancy and beyond. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, that never really happened to me, it could be that it was too soon in the pregnancy. So lactation isn't a guarantee for anyone who loses their baby. It's depending upon the timing during pregnancy. So I just want to kind of be clear with that.
And I think it's still normal to have feelings of sadness surrounding that too, if yours never came in, but you expected it to, or,
Yes,
you know, I think we can have
absolutely.
feelings about it either way.
Right.
So if people wanted to connect with you and find out more information, where would they go for that?
So I do have Instagram on at Breastfeeding Wellness on Instagram. People can find me on LinkedIn, although it's generally professionals, but I'm there. If you're there, I'd love to connect with you. And I also have a webpage. It's protectingyourpotential.com. I recently published a book by a similar name, Protecting Your Potential for Breastfeeding. So if you're interested, you can check that out. There's all kinds of excellent breastfeeding advice and information in there as well.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing all this great information with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a really important topic. And honestly, I just want to say my heart goes out to everybody listening, anyone who's been involved in pregnancy loss and lactation loss. And there are resources, really excellent resources out there for people who do find that they are grieving the process or the lost process of breastfeeding.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for sharing all this amazing information with us. I learned so much, and it really made me want to go out and do even more research on the subject of breastfeeding. I think the most important thing to take away from this episode is that no matter which option you end up choosing after the loss of your baby, the key is to be informed about all of your options. There is no right thing to choose. You can let the milk dry up. You can have some jewelry made. You can choose to donate. We all have to choose what feels best for us during our grief journey. And I wish I had known in those first few days that the milk coming in was just a hormonal response that I had to get through. I was so frustrated at my body, and I was so angry. I was angry that the milk came in, angry that I didn't have my baby, and really angry that I couldn't get it to just go away. If I knew all of what Kelly shared today, I may have made different choices. So again, just go in with all the information and then make the decision that is best for you and your situation. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like the show, please leave a review or rating on Apple or Spotify. It only takes a moment and really helps the show reach more loss and infertility families. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, we are all in this together.